everyone. Welcome to the first of 4 teachings on the parable of the Prodigal Son. Tonight is Monday in Holy Week. We are tracking the last days of Jesus as we head up to Good Friday at the end of this week and then Easter Sunday at the end of the weekend. I'm going to be sharing with you over the next few evenings, tonight, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday night, from Luke 15, where Jesus tells this parable of the prodigal son. And we're going to work through it together systematically. I'm going to start tonight by reading through the text. And I'm going to read it slowly and I'm going to read it carefully. And I want you, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes and to let the words just wash over you. I want you to pay attention to the characters, to the language that is used by Jesus as he tells this story. And I want you to start to pray and reflect on these words as you listen to them. You can follow along in your Bible if you would like. We're in Luke chapter 15, which is the third of the Gospels in the New Testament. You will find that about 2/3 of the way through the Bible if you're new to the Scriptures. And I'm going to read from chapter 15, starting in verse 11, and I'm going to read all the way to verse 32. I'm reading from the NIV translation, and the title says, The Parable of the Lost Son, also often known as the Parable of the Prodigal Son. So, Jesus continued, There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back, safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him? My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Okay, now before we go any further, I want to share with you just a very simple two-part disclaimer that I tell everyone whenever I preach or I teach. The first point is quite simple. I don't know everything. It's important that you understand that, because I expect you to keep your hearts and your minds switched on and tuned in to what I'm saying. So I don't expect, just because it's on the internet, for you just to accept what I'm saying at face value. I'm hoping that you will apply your minds and apply your hearts and think carefully and critically and pray and go and read for yourself and engage with what I've had to share with you over the next few evenings. Secondly, I believe that a sermon or a preaching or a teaching is just the first word. It's not the last word. And the reason I believe that is because what it tells us, the listener, is that it is now our job to take what we've heard and do something with it. And so I am asking you to engage with what I have to say. I am hoping that this will be an opportunity for you to be drawn further into prayer, into meditating, into thinking, into reading, into engaging with God about what He wants to tell you and where He wants to take you through this passage that we're going to look at together. So those two are important as we begin. And it leads me into my next point, which is this. Stories are incredibly powerful. And what we've just listened to is a story. A parable is a story. And the reason they're so powerful is because they hold up a mirror to us so that we can see ourselves more clearly. The idea is this: as we read the story or listen to the story, we interact with the characters and we start to resonate with one or two or more of them. We start to see ourselves in the story. Sometimes we might not like what we see. Other times it might be very comforting to find ourselves in a character that we really resonate with. But that is the whole point of this. And I am hoping that over the course of this week, as we journey towards the celebration of Easter, that we'll be able to journey through this story together, and that you will hear and feel God speaking to you through these characters as you pray and seek Him, and that you will be moved and He will move you to become closer to Him so that He can work in us and we can all become more like Him. Now, first thing I want to look at together is the context of this passage. The purpose of tonight is to look at the background, is to give a broader introduction to the passage before we then look at some of the characters over the next few nights. So we're going to start with context, and then I'm going to take you through the text step by step, and I want to highlight some things that may have been missed at first reading or just of a superficial reading. So for context, we have to go back to the beginning of the chapter. Right at the beginning, in the first two verses of chapter 15, we find out where this narrative is falling, or rather, with whom this narrative is landing. So right at the beginning we read, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear him." So we already have one group of people. We have our tax collectors and our sinners. But there's a second group of people here as well. Verse 2 says, leading into verse 2, But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So now we have two groups of people together, and both groups are hearing Jesus speak the story. But the two groups are rather distinct, and it's important that we understand that, because we're going to see these groups come up in the characters in the story. So, firstly, Jesus is telling this story to a group of people that believe that they're on the inside of God's love and compassion. They know themselves to be religiously right. They are justified. Yes, it's the Pharisees and the lawmakers. They think they're on the inside. Now the second group of people think they're on the outside. They don't believe that God's love and compassion extends to them. They don't see themselves as the religious leaders of the day, and they feel very unwelcomed. They are not accepted. So, you might already start to feel some resonance between yourself and those two groups of people as we talk context. And so I want us all to understand that as we begin here, that this story is not just meant for its original listeners, but for you and for me. And we're invited to wonder whether we see ourselves as those who are justified and on the inside of God's love and compassion, or whether we think of ourselves as outside and unwelcome in God's family. And so, there are three main characters in this story. As we read in verse 11, there was a man who had two sons. So we have a father and we have two young men. But I think that there's more than that in the story, because I would include ourselves as a fourth character, as I said, as we journey through this story together. But also I believe Jesus is there as he leads us through. And so I want to again remind you as we begin, you are invited to think and pray over these characters, to listen for resonance where you might find yourself in this life, where God might be speaking to you, either whether you feel that you're on the inside or whether you feel you're on the outside. Okay, so let's move on. I want to look at just a few aspects. We're going to go not verse by verse, but I'm going to pick some out that just give some background, some weight to the story, without which I don't think we understand just how richly textured it is. So I'm going to start in verse 12, when the young son says to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate. Give me my inheritance. Give me what is coming to me." This is quite a shocking insult for the father to receive from the young boy. And the hearers of that time would have understood it as well. Essentially what this young man is saying to his father is, "You're dead to me. I want it to be as if you no longer exist in my life." His inheritance is only due to him on the death of his father. And so this is a monumental insult for a culture that is very much family oriented. And the hearers of the story would have heard that and been shocked to hear a young man speaking to their father like that. And so we need to feel the weight of that shock if we are to understand the dynamics of the relationship as the story unfolds. Secondly, verses 13 to 16, as the story progresses, I want us to see the depths of the fall of this young man, because he falls a long, long way from where he started. There are three elements to this. The first is a wealth issue. He goes from being rich, being very rich, to being poor. As he moves off into this distant country and he starts to spend lavishly, very soon his money runs out. And all of his good times, friends, are gone. There's nobody left, no money left. And so he has plummeted from being very wealthy, imagine much status, lots of important people around him, lots of parties, lots of great feelings of what this money could bring to his life. And now he has nothing. So it's a dramatic fall. Secondly, in terms of status, the Jewish people hearing the story would have understood exactly what it was for this young man to end up in a pigsty looking after pigs. Pigs are an unclean animal in the Jewish law system. And so for him to be serving an unclean animal and not even being offered the food that the unclean animal was offered, having to sleep around them, be close to them, literally covered. You know what I mean? That's a dramatic fall as well. And again, the original listeners would have heard this and would have been horrified at a Jewish person ending up in that state. Lastly, this young man loses his identity. He goes from being a son to being a servant or a hired hand. He loses his identity within the family system and becomes just one who is paid for a day's work. No longer a child of the Father. He's just a nobody doing what he can to survive. Eventually, at the end of that, in verse 17, he comes to his senses. When he came to his senses is the actual text. Now, this word, coming to his senses in the Greek, essentially can be understood to be saying he comes to himself. When he returns to himself, when he remembers who he is, that's when his life changes. When he comes back to understanding and remembering his connection with home, that's when he turns and he heads there. Then lastly, I want to look briefly at the Father's response, verses 20 to 24. Now the text tells us that while he was still a long way off, nobody sees somebody from a long way off unless they've been looking for them, unless they've been yearning for them day after day, scanning the horizon, waiting for a glimpse of this person. And so we see this amazing response in the Father. If you recall where we started, the insult that is given to him by his youngest boy. You're dead to me. This man, this father, has been yearning for his young son to return home. So we see this depth of longing, this compassion for his son. He runs to him, an incredibly undignified choice for an old man. Men of stature, of wealth, of status, do not run anywhere in this culture. It is seen to be beneath them. But this man does not care. His boy is coming home, and he runs to him. He runs to him. It says in the text, he ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. In other translations it says, he fell on his neck, as if he couldn't even hold himself up. He collapsed onto his young son. The word that is used for compassion in the Greek there literally means to be moved to one's bowels. Isn't that a strange phrase? And if you've ever been moved to your bowels, it's not a comfortable feeling. And this word comes from somewhere because the ancients used to believe that the bowels were the seat of emotions in humans. And so when you're moved to your bowels, you are moved to the core of your being. This is central to the Father's response. This compassion, when he's filled with compassion, he is rocked to the very core of his being when he sees his son coming home. Now, the rest of the text we will get into over the next few evenings as we look at the individual characters in the story. We will start tomorrow night by looking at the young son in relationship with his father. On Wednesday evening, we will look together at the older son and his relationship with his father. And lastly, we will focus on the Father, and we will ask ourselves, what is God trying to tell us, and where to from here? And so I want to invite you to journey together with me through this week. I'm going to ask you to read the passage a few times every day. Read it to yourself as I did earlier. Read it slowly. Read it deliberately. Let the things that I've shared with you tonight sink in as you start to immerse yourself in this story. I'm then going to ask you to meditate each day in preparation for what I'll share with you in the evening. And then pray. Ask God, what is He trying to tell you? Ask Him to reveal His heart to you. Engage with Him. This is an absolute waste of time if we do not engage with God. If this is just a mental exercise or just a pleasant way to spend 30 minutes. I hope it's pleasant. And so it's important that we all engage with God, that we're able to respond to what He says, to the promptings that He gives us as we journey through the story. So may God bless you and keep you. I'm looking forward to continuing from tomorrow night and onwards. And I pray that not only you will be richly rewarded, but those with whom you encounter. Now is a difficult time for our country and for the world as we are in this lockdown state. But God is still alive, and God is still active, and He is still desiring to speak to and with us, and to see us become more and more like His Son Jesus. So join me for this journey. May God bless you and keep you. Amen.